Good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce to you the guest lecturer. Dr. Matthew Petway is an associate professor of Spanish at the University of South Alabama. Some of his research interests are on African Cuban studies, Afro-Caribbean spirituality, Cuban racial discourse and nationalism, Cuban colonial narrative and poetry, critical race studies, and gender and masculinity studies, to name a few. Some of his publications include Ritual and Reason, Negotiating Freedom in the Literature, Juan Francisco Manzano, Black Femininity and the Silence of Domestic Space in the Cemetery on the Sugar Plantation by Jose del Carmen Diaz, and of course, his book, Cuba, Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Placido, and Afro-Latino Religion. And this book will be the basis of his lecture today. Dr. Petway has presented lectures throughout the United States, Japan, Brazil, and Morocco. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Spanish and Media Production from Eastern Michigan University, a Master of Arts degree in Spanish and Latin American literatures, and a PhD in Hispanic Cultural Studies from Michigan State University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to Alcorn State University, Dr. Matthew Petway.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am going to use the microphone as I find it helpful so that everyone can hear everything today that will be said. So I am honored to be here today. As Dr. Johnson said, I am originally from, I don't know if he said this, but I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. We have some Detroiters in the house, as we would say in Detroit. And it is an honor to be here today. I studied Spanish as a non-native speaker. My native tongue is English. So as an African American, to learn the Spanish language and then to use it as a tool to learn about the cultures of the Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, as well as Haiti, and now Brazil, it's really an honor. Today, my talk is titled, Crying Out to a Silent God, Black Manhood and Sexual Vulnerability in the Literature of Juan Francisco Manzano. And I want to dedicate my talk to the Black man who has no language to give voice to his pain. The sexual vulnerability of enslaved African women and girls has been a recurring theme in Hollywood movies for decades. Slavery-themed films such as Sankofa, 12 Years a Slave, and The Birth of a Nation incite feelings of horror and indignation, even as they reinforce the notion that sexual vulnerability is an exclusively female domain. This begs the question, were African women and girls the sole targets of gendered violence throughout the slave era? This is a controversial question to pose in Mississippi, a state that seceded from the Union in defense of African slavery. Mississippi's commitment to the enslavement of Africans was a key tenet to its governance theory, as the 1861 Ordinance of Secession bears out. Quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the products which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. And by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. And a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. This is from 1861, Mississippi Ordinance of Secession, when Mississippi decided to leave the United States of America. For Mississippian slaveholders, abolition will constitute, quote, a blow at slavery and a blow at commerce and civilization, end quote. But the civilization they imagine not only produced, quote, the most important portions of commerce of the earth, but it also constructed enslaved persons as movable property and as commodities that incited desire and disdain in the mind of merchants. In 1859, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled that white women were sacrosanct. Therefore, only sexual violence against a white woman could be deemed rape. In fact, Southern law treated the rape of an enslaved black woman as an offense against the male slaveholder, not the victim herself. An 1858 treatise on slave law stated the following, quote, the violation of the person of a female slave carries with it no other punishment than the damages which the master may recover for the trespass upon his property, end quote. The Mississippi statute was even more egregious than Spanish slave law in the Caribbean and Latin America, which punished white masters, or white enslavers more properly, who had raped or prostituted enslaved black women. In Southern jurisprudence, sexual violence against enslaved black women was not considered rape, regardless of whom the culprit was. Black feminist scholarship has examined the sexual vulnerability of enslaved African women and girls as a strident rebuke to this antebellum double standard in American law. In Women, Race, and Class in 1981, Angela Davis argued, quote, as females, slave women were inherently vulnerable to all forms of sexual coercion, end quote. In 1987, Hortense Spillers, in her essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, asserts much the same. The African female subject is not only the target of rape, but also the topic of specifically externalized acts of torture and prostration, end quote. In an identical manner, Bell Hooks writes, quote, naturally, they feared white sexual obsessions would lead them to be the target of sexualized rage. For black women, being a target meant rape and mutilation. For black men, lynching and mutilation, end quote. And that's from her book, We Will Cool. While gender studies has sought to rectify the personhood of enslaved black women through a necessary study of their sexual vulnerability, it has categorically ignored that African men and boys were subjected to a similar regime of sexual violence. More recently, black male studies scholars such as philosopher Tommy Curry have offered a corrective to this trend in gender studies. In his book, The Man Not, Curry inverts the common association between black maleness and power. Curry demonstrates that gender studies find it difficult to theorize black male victimhood because, quote, the black male's sexual vulnerability is excised from history, end quote, erased from history, effaced from history, taken out of history, not considered historical fact. My lecture contributes to broader efforts by scholars such as Thomas Foster, working in the United States, Robert Richmond Ellis, who wrote about Juan Francisco Manzano, the topic of my conversation, my lecture today, my keynote today, in Cuba, and Lamont Aido, to examine the sexual violation of enslaved men of African descent in the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. Though today I was speaking about Cuba exclusively. In a similar vein, my talk scours the historical and literary record in colonial Cuba to disinter fragmented sources, read them against the grain, and speak when the text is silent. It is my contention that enslaved Cuban author Juan Francisco Manzano, born around 1797, who died in 1853, adopted rhetorical strategies in his literature to achieve two aims: portray that he was raped by overseers, and subsequently restore a sense of manhood to himself. Manhood is not the exclusive domain of patriarchy, but rather I define it in my work as an affirmative self-concept and an ethical commitment to black community. I will show how Manzano relied upon autobiography and poetry, such as the poem To Jesus on the Cross, which he published in 1841, to redeem himself from the girl-child, roguish Negro dichotomy that his mistress had imposed upon him. Cuban slaveholders demonstrated a proclivity for the procurement of African men and boys to the extent that many refused to purchase women throughout the 19th century. African men and boys were continuously propelled into the slave trade to Cuba and other Latin American destinations like Brazil, even after the British outlawed the slave trade in 1807. So the slave trade to Cuba continued well into the 19th century. And slavery was not abolished in Cuba until 1886, after it was abolished in the United States. So this is after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. In the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James explains the situation in Africa would purchase scarcity. Quote, tribes had to supply slaves or be sold as slaves themselves. Violence and ferocity became the necessities for survival, and violence and ferocity survived, end quote. Economic conditions in the Caribbean also spurred an increase in human trafficking of African men in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Cuba replaced Saint-Domingue, later named Haiti, as the leading sugar-producing colony in the world after the triumph of the Haitian Revolution in 1804. Despite the historical context, gender studies tend to disregard or altogether misunderstand the impact of the Atlantic slave trade on the development of Black manhood. As a result, the field continues to caricature Black men as mere reactionaries, seeking to achieve patriarchy through violence, brutality, and hypersexuality. Patriarchy, however, is not the domination of all women by all men, as is often asserted. Jamaican scholar Errol Miller defines patriarchy as a kinship system, where men and women of the dominant group exercise power together to the detriment of members of the outgroup. In light of the historical evidence, I consider the Atlantic slave trade to Cuba as an economic and ideological venture that produced racist misandry. Misandry is effectively an adverse attitude toward men, but in this case I'm talking specifically about racialized men. Black male studies scholars use the term racist misandry to critique the field of gender studies for stereotyping Black men as inherently criminal, prone to rape and murder. To expound upon the unique vulnerability of Black men, Tommy Curry employs the term phallicism to explain that racialized men and boys are imagined as sexual predators and are targeted as sexual prey at the very same time. And a new project that I'm doing that I won't expound upon today in Brazil, there's extraordinary amount of evidence for it. So just to be a bit honest myself, I always reach out to my friends and I say, today I'm working on that project. So keep me in your thoughts. And my good friends, Black men, Black women, both do that for me. This caricature of Black men justifies lethal violence against them. It fulfills the fantasies of the dominant racial or ethnic group. Phallicism aptly applies or aptly describes the vulnerabilities of the poet we'll be talking about today, Manzano. And I will look at the slave narrative and briefly at his poem To Jesus on the Cross in order to demonstrate this. So I'll talk here about, here's a photograph actually of an enslaved man in Brazil in the 19th century. And this image for me was particularly striking. We don't have his name. These photographs were produced by a German man. We don't have this man's name, unfortunately, but this is toward the end of the 19th century. I believe this is the 1860s. But there's something in his eye that says he may not have a language to explain whatever the pain is he's experiencing. So I want us to think about men of African descent differently, and I hope that the talk will help lead us in that direction. Very briefly, I want to show you this mural from Old Havana. It depicts a Cuban literati, which you see here on, I want to say, well, it's my left, so I guess it's your right. And these two gentlemen are considered the most significant poets of African descent in early Cuban literature. The one here, in the black suit, this is a representation of Manzano, Juan Francisco Manzano. He produced the only slave autobiography, and he did it 5 years before Frederick Douglass. It was published in English in 1840 in London. He wrote it in Spanish, though. We'll be citing from it, my own translation. And the other gentleman is Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, otherwise known as Plácido. And Plácido was something like Martin Delany. He was born free, and he was very politically active. He was a revolutionary poet. He and Manzano met at a cockfight. That's what men did, and still do in the Caribbean. No European is about cockfights, but that's where they met. And it's pretty violent, that's why I'm mentioning it. But they met at a cockfight, they became friends, and they began to exchange poetry, and they became politically active. I write about that in the last chapter of the book, and it had some negative consequences for both of them. Very briefly, I want to point out that Manzano was born in 1797 in Havana. His mother was Maria del Pilar, and his father was Toribio de Castro. His grandfather gifted him a horse, which is, I think, significant. I'm come back to that briefly. His father was a tailor, and his father taught him to sew. One thing I found very interesting when I visited Ghana many years back was that the boys were weeding. Was it Kumasi? Yeah, it was Kumasi, or outside Kumasi, the Asante boys. It was considered a masculine task. Manzano explored the sugar plantation, or the labor camp, as I like to call it, somewhere around 1817. He went to Havana. He wasn't instantly freed, but he did escape the violence that was being meted out. And he availed himself of these literary networks to start publishing. 1821, he produces the first collection of poetry by any Cuban, black or white. And between 1834 and 1836, he finishes his slave narrative. Some says it's 1835. I think it might be more likely that it's 1836 because that's when he was finally freed. He was told, if you produce your slave narrative, we will buy your freedom. So that's what he did. He died in 1853. In the last chapter of the book, I do deal with his involvement in this anti-slavery conspiracy, anti-slavery movement. Some have argued that he was not involved. I believe that he was, but in a tangential fashion. The Plácido was more involved. So thank you for that. I just wanted to briefly give you just a little bit of background. This is a photograph from the plantation where Manzano was enslaved. This was placed online by, I believe, a Brazilian photographer. Irish abolitionist Richard Robert Madden smuggled Manzano's autobiography out of Havana, translated it into English, and published it in London in 1840. Segments of the slave narrative were also translated into French, enhancing his debut on the literary stage. Even more remarkable is the fact that Manzano's Cuban slave narrative preceded the works of Frederick Douglass, who were published in 1845, and William Wells Brown, who published in 1847. Okay? So this put him on the world stage, even though he never left Cuba. Cuban slavery was a peculiar yet familiar institution. Plantations were divided along two axes, black and mulatto, one responsible for field labor and the other domestic industry. Juan Francisco Manzano's family labored in the big house, where his mother, Maria del Pilar, was a black wet nurse and the lead female servant. He mentions his mother first in the novel. He really structures the novel around his mother, but he does not neglect his father. Toribio de Castro was a mulatto harpist and esteemed tailor within the home of the Marchioness Doña Beatriz de Justicia Santa Ana and her husband, Marquis Don Juan Manzano. Feminist scholar Saida Hartman explains that the racist logic of the plantation imagined the enslaved as both property and person. Property because Manzano's family members could be bought and sold at will, and person because the enslaved could be held responsible for crimes they allegedly committed. So this was a perverse web of reciprocity. and it created intimacy with the enslaver and domination at the same time. Manzano's first enslaver, Doña Beatriz, maintained a paternalistic relationship with his father. She evidently considered herself a good woman, so she freed, I think his younger brother, younger sister. But then one has to ask, where are they to go if they're freed and the family is still enslaved? So was that really a gesture? Wouldn't the right thing to have been to have freed the family and to provide reparations for that family? But that was not her politics. Manzano was objectified as his mistress's plaything, as some sort of amusement, quote, end quote, and he was intentionally distanced from his birth family. I am going to read some passages from his slave narrative, which I quoted in my book. His narrative is available in English translation by Ivan Schumann. I think Wayne State University Press published it. This particular passage won't appear on the screen, but I promise you others will. I want this to be as understandable and accessible as possible. So regarding the young Manzano, I want to contrast the way he was treated as a boy with the way he was treated as an adolescent. When does a black boy stop being cute? Doña Joaquina treated me like a child. She dressed me, combed my hair, and saw to it that I did not mingle with the other little black children at the same table. As in the age of the Marchioness Justice, she served me my food, and I ate at the feet of my mistress, the Marchioness of Prado Ameno. I spent this entire period far from my parents, but when they found out that I was at the service of my mistress in this period, I was 12 years old. So one way in which a child becomes vulnerable, they're distanced from their family, against their family's will, without their family's consent. In this case, without the knowledge or consent of their family. So we should think about the Atlantic slave trade as well as a child trafficking enterprise. As a young child, Manzano was clothed, fed, and groomed by white women in the big house. As a mulatto boy, he was carried to French operas, he went to mass, frequented the theater, he was made to sit on the floor and eat at the feet of his mistresses. This perverse web of reciprocity meant Manzano was given an illusory sense of privilege. He was granted proximity to whiteness, even as his racial status was mockingly reinforced. Presumably he had somewhat lighter skin, but we don't know, we don't have a portrait of Manzano. Manzano demonstrates the power of race in social practice by depicting himself through his enslaver's lens as an object of her amusement. Those are his words. Género de entretenimiento is what he says. Thus he reveals that his mistress's paternalism displaced his mother's and father's authority because the white gaze was predicated on the power of the law and the ever-present threat of violence. Manzano's family adopted a series of rational tactics designed to maintain their status as household servants, offer some modicum of protection for their offspring, and to help him to avoid the worst punishments. For instance, Manzano's grandfather, who remained anonymous throughout the narrative, bequeathed a horse to Juan Francisco to afford him an inheritance, which was permissible under Spanish law. Manzano's father taught him to sew so he might exercise a reputable profession. And once his father had died, Manzano's mother provided him the money necessary to buy his freedom from his second and far crueler mistress, the Marchioness of Prado de Ameno. But despite all their strategic planning, Manzano's parents held no legal authority over his life that white Cubans were bound to respect. For instance, when Manzano's father, Toribio de Castro, disciplined him on more than one occasion for childhood pranks in hopes of protecting him from worse forms of punishment, Doña Beatriz forbade that his father subject him to corporal punishment, and she went to the priest in order to reinforce her authority. Quote from Manzano's autobiography: on one occasion, because I was acting so foolishly, that my father shook me up so hard that when my mistress found out, that was enough for her to refuse to see him for several days, until at the request of her confessor, Father Moya, a Franciscan priest, she led him back into her good graces, end quote. Father Moya intervened on Doña Beatriz's behalf to reprimand Toribio de Castro, put him in his place, and remind him that only the slave owner had the authority to strike the young child. Thus, the Franciscan friar performed his ecclesiastical duties by reiterating what Hortense Spillers has demonstrated in the American context. Manzano did not belong to the man that sired him, but rather to the woman that owned him. I want to speak now about the second enslaver, the Marchioness of Prado de Almeno. She was the daughter of the first mistress. Prado de Almeno exerted control over Manzano, not only through her actions, but also through a racial discourse meant to manipulate him. Manzano invited his readers to view him through the prism of his enslavers. So she would refer to him in different ways. She would call him the Chinito, the Mulatico de la Marquesa. Chinito, in this case, doesn't mean a little Chinese guy, but it means a mixture between a person who's considered racially black and a person who's considered racially mulatto. So the idea of people of African descent of varying hues in Spanish America, they were classified as different races. And that was a divide and conquer strategy. But they were subjected to similar forms of violence. But the idea was to get them to talk about whose nose was just a little bit, narrower, those sorts of things that are immaterial. And so Manzano was being told that he was special. And then the second mistress demonstrates just how special he was. Manzano seems to have come to a point in his life where he began to question what his second mistress was doing, because he wrote, quote, let me see if I have it here for you. I do. Quote, it's astonishing that my mistress could not be without me for 10 days in a row. That's why my detention never endured for more than 11 or 12 days, describing me always as the worst one ever born on the El Molino plantation, where it was said that I was Creole. That was another sort of mortification for me. So I want you to think about what she's saying here. He's the worst one ever born on the plantation. So how does he go from being a form of amusement to the worst one on the plantation? When does a black boy cease to be cute? Manzano's assertion describing me always as the worst one ever born on the sugar plantation is reminiscent of what philosopher Tommy Curry has written about the vulnerability of racialized men under patriarchy. So I want to bring in the Black male studies intervention again from philosopher Tommy Curry, who's from Louisiana. Quote, traditional theories of patriarchy assume the biologic of the body, specifically the male genitalia, is indicative of a social pact of sorts, whereby all penis-wielding flesh is both a physical and social threat to women, end quote. Curry borrows from Errol Miller in his work. Miller argues that patriarchy is not the domination of all women by all men, as is often asserted, but rather that patriarchy is a kinship system. So patriarchy, the patriarch and the patriarch's female partner are working for the interests of the group. And this is something we can see in the history of Mississippi, Alabama, where I currently live, where my father was born, Ashe, is that women of European descent also owned enslaved people and had no less power over them than the men, right? It's just that the women of European descent had less power in the system because of the myth of male supremacy that the Europeans insisted on. So instead of, under patriarchy, not only Miller but other scholars have clarified that patriarchy functions in a way in which women of the dominant group and women of the subordinate group are controlled. The idea is to control women is to control their reproductive health, is to prevent them from exercising political power or economic power that's independent of men. But when it comes to racialized men or outgroup men, they are seen as potential combatants. The fear is that they may take up arms, and so they are targeted in education, to be miseducated. They are removed from civil society through incarceration, mass incarceration, and they are targeted as well. They are sent to the military as well, so they can be in the interest of the empire, the power of the empire. Manzano was caught in a conundrum. He was perceived as a threat to white persons, presumably white women, yet as he was being the only one victimized, even as he was being victimized and beaten. On at least one occasion, that victimization translated into the sexual assault of Juan Francisco Manzano. A sequential reconstruction of events is imperative. Manzano's mistress condemned him to the stocks for crushing a flower, a generium. They broke his nose, and a colonial administrator, an immigrant from San Domingue, confined him to the stocks in a desolate infirmary on the San Miguel Plantation, imbued with the presence of meandering spirits of the dead. What Manzano construed as a torment of maleficent spirits devolved into a nightmarish rape scenario when two men forced him onto a wooden plank, quote, tied his hands like those of Jesus Christ, end quote, fastened his feet in the stocks, and bound them further as to render his body vulnerable to penetration. So he uses the Christ metaphor in order to explain what happened to him. So they had beaten him several times before, and he writes about that. But this is the only instance where he says his hands were tied and his feet were tied, that the white overseer came in and the black male slave driver came in. Why would it take two people if he's a small adolescent? Lorna Williams, a literary scholar, draws attention to silences in the passage as the author's self-assertion. Susan Willis, another scholar, believes the sudden shift from the imperfect tense to the present tense, from the imperfect tense to the present tense indicates a trauma experience again. But Ellis reads silence as the absence of language, the rupture of a discursive thread produced by traumatic sexual experience, which he surmises may have occurred more than once. So Robert Richmond Ellis was the first to write about this. And once again, at the moment of openness, when I first saw it, I didn't initially want to agree, but I read and reread, and I realized that it was an accurate reading. I'm going to go a bit beyond what Robert Richmond Ellis not alleges, but what he argues in his article. Manzano's use of Catholicism to condemn the sexual violence committed against him and present himself as an ethical subject has historical precedence in Brazil. Historian Lamont Aido argues that enslaved African men in Brazil who had been raped by white men relied on Catholic doctrine to persuade church authorities to punish their legal owners. Lamont Aido writes, quote, using faith and their knowledge of church doctrine and what constituted sin and stating their claims against their masters proved to be a powerful form of resistance against shame and objection, end quote. But there is more to be said about this obscure matter. The rhetorical veil that Manzano used to evade the unwholesome gaze of his readership safeguarded his body even as it divulged the secret. The confrontation between the contramayoral, the black slave driver, the administrator who was white, and Manzano made the infirmary into homoerotic space where the small degree of bodily integrity that he had could be wrested away. The metaphor of the suffering Christ not only identified the enslaved with the Lamb of God, a theme that would resurface in his poetry, but it also conjured up the image of the Roman cross, not as a sacred symbol of redemption, but rather an instrument of torture. If the arms were extended and fastened to the wooden board, then the supine body is exposed to the veiled gaze and all its instrumentality. Draped in a cloak with a handkerchief covering his deep voice, that's what Manzano calls it, the administrator emerged as the agent of patriarchy, whose limitless authority over the African-descended male body allowed him to feminize the girl child by performing the lowest act of degradation imaginable. Abnegated in tears and embraced by his mother and afflicted by hemorrhaging, Manzano's body had been broken. He was virtually condemned to social death. What the author relates after his incident may be as telling as a violation itself. Manzano recalled, "Por pocos más se levantó, mi señora fue a su primera diligencia en ponerse de si se me había tratado bien el administrador, que la esperaba me llamó y me la presentó, me preguntó si se quería otra vez tomar unas hojas de su genario." In English, a little later my mistress awoke and her first diligence was to take it upon herself to see if the administrator had treated me fittingly. I waited for her. She called for me, and I presented myself before her. She asked me if I might want to take another generium leaf. Manzano's narrative sequence did more than implicate Prado Ameno in the crime. It afforded her masculinity and thus transformed her into the symbolic agent of rape. The following passage from Manzano's slave narrative reveals why he became vulnerable to sexual assault. So why did he go from being this form of amusement to being vulnerable to sexual assault? And I wanted to share this passage with you because I wanted to think about the family strategies, Manzano's strategies. He was victimized, but being what I consider a poetic genius. How do you write a book about your life if you haven't formally been taught to read and write? Right? Writing a book is hard. I want us to focus on those strategies that Manzano used. So have language for the pain and then strategies for healing. This is about the healing of Black men. It's about the healing of Black women. It's about the healing of Black children. So here's the passage I want to read from the slave narrative. Quote, "On the 6th day, I was able to walk a little again. It was around midnight when I met up with my mother, whom walked under the canopy to meet me and told me, Juan, here I carry the money for your freedom. You see that your father has already died, and you'll be a father to your siblings. They will not chastise you again." So instead of thinking about Manzano's mother and father in conflict with one another, thinking about the mother as a heroine and the father as an antagonist, Manzano talks about the imperfections of his father, certainly. But Manzano said that he was always a bit safer when his father was around, and I want to read that passage to you in a second. It is important to note the chronological order of events. The rape scene appears in the narrative after Manzano's father had already died. Manzano's body was injured to such an extent that he was unable to walk for nearly a week. His enslavers placed him in a room to recover, where he took therapeutic baths and put ointments on his wounds. His mother only came to visit him at night when her mistress was in town for fear the Marchioness would discover what she was doing. Maria del Pilar arrived with the money necessary for her son to liberate himself, and she entrusted him, quote, to be a father to his siblings, end quote. Though Manzano's autobiography might be classified as a matrilineal narrative, it consistently reiterates the significance of his father as a man of honor and a protector. Manzano writes the following. "The sullen temperament and the honor of my father, since I was always in his sight, made certain that I experienced a somewhat more tolerable life. I did not suffer the horrible and persistent whippings or the slaps that a boy who is far removed from his relatives suffers, although the miserable slaps in the face and the broken nose were always with me." So I've highlighted here a couple of passages here where Manzano talks about the honor of his father, something that was denied all enslaved persons. And then he says he was always in his father's sight. Remember, his father taught him to sew. And then he says he had a somewhat more tolerable life, right? So he is valuable. His mother was a Black Cuban woman, and his father was a Black Cuban man in his upbringing. Even as an enslaved person, he had the understanding that both were necessary in the raising of a child, that you need the masculine and the feminine to be whole, as I like to say. But the violence that we see in Juan Francisco Manzano is far too close to home if we think about Mississippian patriarchy. If we think about the 6 officers that were recently convicted for committing violent crimes against 2 Mississippi men, Black lawyers for justice really brought this case to the fore. And I won't mention the men's names to honor them, but I do want to briefly mention what happened to them because there's a parallel between what happened to them and what happened to Manzano. One of the victims had a gun placed in his mouth. Both of the victims were physically beaten. One of the victims was shot through the mouth. They were assaulted with a sex toy while racial slurs were being shouted at them. Why would the officers be interested in that? They planted drugs on them to provide a pretext for the raid. and they stripped them naked and left one victim to bleed. And they went out on the porch and began to conspire how they might hide their crimes. According to Black Lawyers for Justice, this will be the first time in the history of Mississippi that a police officer will be convicted. The symbolic order did not allow Manzano to consign his father honra, a concept rooted in medieval and Renaissance Spain and based on notions of legitimate birth, nobility, and whiteness. As an enslaved man, Toribio de Castro was bereft of social legitimacy and symbolic power, and as long as he remained in bondage as a black man, he would never be able to acquire honra, which is another word for honor, but honor you're born with in Spanish. Manzano did not derive his notion of honor from the Hispano-Catholic archetype. Rather, his father was an honorable black man because he afforded Manzano protection and strengthened him as a bulwark against the hostility of Spanish Catholic patriarchy. Though he could not end the physical and psychological mistreatment, Toribio de Castro did provide Juan Francisco more than the appearance of safety, because the frequency and intensity of the abuse subsided. The narrative singles out the black father figure as protector and attributes his actions to African descendant notions of honor. A breakdown of the corporeal schema signaled violence untold and bespoke Manzano's struggle to assert masculinity in the course of an existential crisis. The mere image of the administrator seated on a horse provoked memories of Manzano's public incarceration. The author reimagined his body bound like a delinquent, outfitted in the attire of field workers, and his head shorn upon his release from the Matanzas public jail. As Manzano said, in that moment I determined my escape, because without parents, siblings, or even relatives, he saw himself, in a word, as a mulatto among blacks. As Tommy Curry has explained, to remedy the imperceptibility of sexual oppression and violence under the male category, the author gives a historical account of the development of racist or anti-black misandry throughout the centuries and proposes a theory of phallicism to describe the seemingly contradictory constructions of black men as sexually predatory, as in the case of the rapist, but nonetheless sexually vulnerable and raped under patriarchy. Manzano's slave narrative demonstrates that he was perceived as a predator and simultaneously treated as prey. After his escape to Havana on horseback, perhaps on the horse his grandfather had gifted him, Juan Francisco Manzano used poetry to resolve the predator-prey contradiction inherent in white constructions of black Cuban masculinity. So I'm going to talk now briefly about a poem that Manzano wrote as I move towards a conclusion. In 1835, more than 10 years after achieving some measure of celebrity, Manzano reminisced about how he had taught himself to read and write. Manzano described his autodidactic process in the slave narrative that Domingo del Monte had requested of him. Remember the quid pro quo: if you write your slave narrative, we will purchase your freedom. But for the meager instruction that Manzano's baptismal godmother provided him, Manzano received no formal humanistic training. Spanish-American slave codes prohibited enslaved Africans and Afro-Latin Americans from pursuing a formal education, and Prado Ameno had gone to great lengths, even resorted to violence, to prevent Manzano from concocting short stories and improvising poetry. There's a young woman named Serafina that he would improvise poetry for. So he's kind of rapping, but it was actually a Spanish form called the decima. Despite his enslaver's best efforts, Juan Francisco Manzano taught himself to read and write, and ultimately fulfilled his dreams of becoming a poet. He produced the only known slave narrative in the history of Spanish America, written by the enslaved person himself. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1841, A Jesús en la Cruz, or To Jesus on the Cross, appeared on Good Friday in Diario de la Habana, alongside other poems Manzano transformed an ode to the suffering Christ into what African American scholars call a Jeremiad. Much like his other religious poetry, to Jesus on the cross, the people of Israel again intone praises to the Christian God. The blood sacrifice of Christ crucified is a fulfillment of prophetic tradition, and it is a necessary atonement for human transgressions. Manzano wrote, I'll give you, I think I have this part here. This is only the second part. So I'm going to read the second part for the sake of time. So in the poem itself, I argue that Manzano honors Christ, but that Christ does not appear as a redemptive figure. And I'm going to read these verses first, so I can explain why. Quote, this is Manzano using an apostrophe, the rhetorical device to talk directly to Jesus Christ. Respectfully, comma, quote, and why does stone lie upon stone when they deprive you of life-giving breath? Why doesn't your piety frighten death when they consign such terrible intent? Why docile and defenseless like the ivy which is strewn by torrential winds, you let yourself be overcome by irreverent people whom your very breath would scorch? And then Manzano says, sign of redemption, mute symbol of charity, an infinite fountain, where Christians find all they can from their immense creator, the sublime mind, to you, the always indestructible bond. Take me joined together in the ardent love with which you prove to man your tenderness. My judgment shows the way to your eternal felicity. The Son of God is not a redemptive figure in this poem. Rather, Manzano portrayed Jesus Christ as a vacuous symbol, unable or perhaps unwilling to rescue Black Cubans from slavery. Such a statement might be deemed heretical, if not for the lyrical play on words. Christ is a symbol of charity that does not protest crucifixion at the hands of Roman soldiers, but his silence might also imply an unmerciful response to the cries of Black misery. Manzano employed nature metaphors such as the ivy plant, commonly associated with femininity, to depict crucifixion as a violation of manhood. Christ is dócil y fácil como la hiedra, docile and defenseless like the ivy plant. Rather than portraying the blood of Christ for its sacred and redemptive qualities, Manzano suggested that Christ crucified lay prostrate like the ivy. As Liza Bakewell points out, blood and guts are a symbol of sacrifice in Spanish America, as evidenced by the blood of Christ and that of war heroes. Perhaps most appallingly, Christ was submissive in the face of physical violence and permitted other men to humiliate him. These humiliations were comparable to that which Manzano had grieved in his flesh. What drove Manzano's lyrical protest was the collapse of his own corporeal schema and the multiple ways in which slavery had deprived him of cultural power, both symbolic and real. The marshness of Bravo Ameno made Manzano suffer because he was a young Black man with intellectual gifts that might be developed into an anti-slavery ideology. Remember, he works with Palacio towards the end of his life. Anti-slavery ideology would challenge her authority and endanger her means to wealth. Manzano struggled to unshackle his mind, for it was the theft of the mind that made the African-descended body compliant to the dictates of white supremacy. Thank you. I'm open to any questions. We have, I don't want to turn the lights up now, or lighten the mood if that's possible. Ojalá. Ojalá. Yes.
Can you briefly go back over what you said, like the ivy plant represented, like as a crucifixion of Jesus?
Okay. Yes. I believe it's here. Okay, it's not here in this particular. I don't have it. Actually physically here on the screen. But essentially, the ivy, as you know, just kind of lies there, right? In the older, I think of the universities out east, some of the Ivy Leagues, they call them Ivy Leagues because they're covered in these ivy plants. And so it's known for its beauty. In the United States, it's kind of thought of, it's associated with institutions of higher learning, some of the first institutions of higher learning in Cambridge and places like Princeton, things of that sort. But it's also associated with femininity because of its beauty. And so what Manzano does is he says, like that Christ lied there like ivy, that he didn't get up, he didn't protest, he allowed himself to be humiliated, and that humiliation was insufferable for Manzano. But what Manzano can't say is anything beyond that. Even what he said there was risky. He got it published, but all poetry was and all other writings were censored in colonial Cuba, throughout Spanish America. There was no freedom of the press like you had here in the United States, or even in the 13 colonies. There was no such thing. So that's why his slave narrative had to be smuggled out of Cuba under the cover of night and then translated and published in London. It didn't become available in Cuba until the 1870s and only in snippets. And that was doing a brief reprieve. But essentially, I read that as Manzano looking at Christ not as a redemptive figure. He never appears as a redemptive figure in Manzano's poetry or his prose. The only time he really makes a statement that, that is a very strong personal type of Christian statement is when he's on trial for, he's been accused of a conspiracy to eradicate or to commit genocide against white people. That's what they call the movement to end slavery in Cuba. He said, oh, no, this is white genocide. That's what this is. And so at that point, he's talking about the Holy Ghost, and he says, hey, I don't even know Placido all that well. We were just talking about women, and I don't even know what we're talking about. That's when he becomes very, it's very familiar to me the way he takes those steps back. He's afraid, afraid for his life. He was ultimately acquitted, but that's the point that I'm making there. I hope, is that clear?
Yes, sir.
I don't want to give too many details. Yes, ma'am. What's your name? Can you state your name, what you study?
Okay, my name is Jalen Hinton, and I'm an English literature major here.
Okay.
So I actually have two questions. That's all right.
Yes.
So my first question is discourse around like feminism now and like early feminism movements and like feminism movements now associate like feminism with like white women rights and equity. So would you say that it can be argued that the understanding of the patriarchy can be like associated or viewed from the lens of white superiority or white male empowerment?
What do you mean viewed as?
Like, can you associate the patriarchy and this concept of the patriarchy with white superiority? Like, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The critique that Black male studies scholars have proffered with regard to how we talk about gender is around a number of things, but very briefly, particularly patriarchy. So patriarchy appears in the work of folks like bell hooks as essentially the oppression of all women by all men. And it's an understanding of patriarchy, it's a definition that's limited and it's not historically grounded. So it's not as if Europeans were the only patriarchal societies to exist, but at one point when patriarchy was discussed, it was discussed as a group effort. It was understood as a group effort. So I'll say this briefly. Tommy Kerr deals with it in greater detail in the book Not, which I think I also suggest people buy, is that when white women in the United States make the protests and call themselves feminists, some of them are explicitly saying we want to share the spoils. We want more of the spoils. We want more power. We can rule over the darker races. They had already been ruling over the darker races, as is the case with the Martianists, Justicia Santana, his first enslaver, and his second enslaver. Even his baptismal godmother, who's taking him to the French opera, she's still ruling over him. That's not her child. That wasn't her right. And so what we're saying is that when we do gender studies, we need to root it, carefully historicize it, because what patriarchy seeks to do, in fact, is a kinship system where the older men particularly, exercise power over women and children. But it's within the interest of the kinship group. So that one way in which you can see that is that when Ida B. Wells, the Memphian, wrote about the lynching, she was talking overwhelmingly about the lynching of black men. We know that, right? And sometimes she was talking about cases in which white women had consensual relationships with black men. But these two people had the right to have those relationships if that's what they chose. But white men used that, or white women would say, oh, I was raped, or he made a pass at me, or something like that. And so that was her way then of making him vulnerable. So then he, her former lover, or boyfriend, or whomever, then could be lynched, and her hands are clean. So she's with Emmett Till as well. May he rest in peace, right? The truth comes out right before that woman passes away. They ain't doing anything to that woman whatsoever. So she's active in it, right? It doesn't mean that men of racialized men can't have sexist ideas or sexist attitudes, but the conversation that I really hope to help to encourage is that black men and black women will sit down at the same table and have conversations. What does it look like to be each other's co-pilots? And if you're talking about same gender loving men or same gender loving women, that they can sit down and say, what is it like to be each other's co-pilots, right? How do we eschew what we were taught by enslavers, or what was modeled for us by enslavers, right? Which is, you are my thing, right? So is that a good answer? Is that a complete answer?
Yes, and it kind of leads.
Yes, you have the second one though.
Yes, it kind of leads into my second question. So I think now many young boys, specifically black boys, are exposed to like sexual practices at a young age, like as early as like 11. And so my question is, do you think that early exposure contributes to a lack of scholarship around sexual vulnerability with black men because sexuality is tied with manhood?
I don't know if there's a correlation between the lack of scholarship and the early introduction of black boys to sexuality. I don't know if that's be a great question for a sociologist. What I can say is that I think that when Angela Davis writes some of her early work in the 70s, she says, look, when I look at they can call it black studies, but when I look at what we might now call black studies, black women are absent. I believe that that has been corrected for in a great way. It's not that work needs to cease, but that we need, if someone decides to become a professor, they need to find a way in the class to say, sure, if you want to study black women and you're a black woman, that's fine, but you also need to learn about the vulnerability of black men so that when you're teaching, you can teach about both. And you can help your nephews out better, you can help your brothers out better, you can listen better, right? So that's effectively there. But I think, so to answer your question a little bit better, I think one of the reasons why it doesn't happen as much, because there aren't people who are placing it in the center. One thing that intersectionality does, it says that we need to privilege the most vulnerable among any given group. But within the black race, in the United States, what Tommy Curry is arguing is that when you look at statistics, black men have poor educational outcomes. So even where I teach, about 7 out of 10 black women who graduate who start, about 3 out of 10 black men, a little bit less. And the number for Latino men is a little bit lower than that. And you can just go all over the country, you can see it. So that's just one indicator that the notion of black male privilege that intersectionality proffers is mistaken. It's not grounded in fact.
So this is just to build off a little bit of Jalen's question and like what you were just saying. So like the feminist movement right now is like just being dominated by like white women, and black women have tried almost to fruitless efforts to have themselves included in it, and whatever like movements and changes that they've gotten have just been like the kind of like the skirts of whatever the white women have gotten through. Do you believe like the way for like feminist movements to like truly like make a difference is like through understanding like what the patriarchal system has in place for like men?
I think I would like to see any woman or man, because sometimes you'll have same gender loving men who are like, hey look, I'm a feminist. And what I've noticed is that sometimes that means that there's an attention placed on black men there's an assumption of guilt, kind of. I'll put it like that. There's a kind of an assumption of guilt. And I think you don't want to start there, right? I would like to see more young, I always call my students, I say, ustedes son jóvenes intelectuales. You as a young intellectual, I like to see more young intellectuals, male and female, Black and Latino, right? To, when they study the question of gender, to ask, okay, how are Black women vulnerable? Black women are vulnerable, for example, in terms of childbirth, in terms of breast cancer, right? So let's put the resources that they need there, and then let's turn around and ask how are Black men vulnerable? And let's put the resources there, instead of just privileging one or two. So I've begun to listen to Clenora Hudson Weems, who's an Africana womanist, in order to present my students, most of whom are women, brilliant young women, to provide them with some tools to rethink, because what Africana womanism does, instead of putting the individual in the center, or putting gender as the first matter of consideration, it puts the family in the center, which is really what West African people did. The family was at the center. It's a very, very different notion. And it can be difficult to do, but I think it's possible. Yes?
What about the consideration for non-heteronormative family dynamics? Because I know you talk a lot about, in your research, how, the man's name, but how he maybe having not the present provider father in his life was a detriment to him.
Oh, Manzano.
Manzano, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you consider, like,
Oh, for families where you have two women or two men?
yeah.
That's kind of a sociological prescription. So I don't want to tell people how to live their lives, absolutely not. I think any type of reform that would happen would definitely, absolutely include same gender loving people who don't identify with the gender assigned at birth, as well as people who identify with the gender assigned at birth and who marry the opposite sex. So the point of the lecture today is not to question same-sex relationships between women that are consensual, same-sex relationships between men that are consensual, but rather to condemn violence, sexual violence. Yeah.
So the sexual violence that is, I guess, or I don't even know how to frame this question, but I guess what do you think would be the best approach? Because you're talking a lot about, like, for women's issues, like birth, or like, yeah, I guess the sexual violence inflicted for like man, woman, like birth rates and that kind of stuff. So like, what would you, I guess, consider if, like, for issues that are not related to that kind of dynamic, because there is a lot of violence that is inflicted that is not necessarily within hetero dynamics.
Oh,
but
yes,
it's also
yes.
sexual.
So I'll share this. So part of the new project I'm looking at, I'm asking, this is a very, very early stage. I won the Fulbright, and I'll be traveling to Brazil this fall, or this summer, but I'm asking, what are the philosophical and ethical foundations of Black Brazilian manhood, sexuality, and kinship? And so when I say sexuality, I'm definitely talking about men who partner with women, but I'm also talking about men who partner with men. And the reason why is because I feel like that's another one of the divides, you know? So in order to mediate that divide, I'm looking at some pre-colonial Angolan understandings of what they call third gender. They had a third gender category, and that third gender category, the person was considered neither male nor female, and they were spiritually, they were supposed to navigate between both worlds, but they were sacred persons. And when I saw it, my jaw dropped. Because it reminded me of the two-spirit in the Native American society. So I think that the conversation is one of respect, right? It's absolutely one of respect. And I have colleagues from college I used to teach at Bates College, and these two guys are raising two brilliant young Black boys, you know. And so, and I'm sure they find ways to bring female influence into their household, you know. So I want to say that this idea of this project is to condemn sexual violence, not to condemn same-sex activity or same-sex attraction, which is part of the human variant and it's natural, just as opposite sex attraction is natural.
I had a question as well.
So you talk a lot about Black masculinity and Black manhood, and so I was just wondering, because Black men often don't really sit down and articulate a lot of the issues that make them vulnerable. So in investigating this, and Black manhood being a kind of a monolith in a sense, like we only see it one way.
Okay.
What gaps did you notice while you were doing your project, or anything that kind of stuck out to you that could use a little bit more research, or has some big implications in how we look at Black men?
Thank you for that question. I think there's a difference between what sociologists and social scientists are doing, where they're trying to get out and find out how are people living, who has experienced this in their real life, who needs counseling, what kind of counseling can be made available, versus people who are literary and cultural studies scholars like myself, who are asking, what does this text tell me? What does this autobiography tell me? What does this poem tell me about what this person might have experienced? What does it tell me about history? Does it tell me about their ethics, right? So people who are looking at, people who are in the social sciences are asking, how do we get therapy, and how do we get more Black male therapists, and how do we make therapy responsive too? So I'll say this, and this is atypical for a professor to say at a presentation, but when my mother passed, I had a boss, a Black male boss, and he was like, I was growing my hair out. This was way before that was popular. I was looking a mess. And I was brooding, and I was chubby, and I was walking to work, and he was like, you need to go see a therapist. And I'm thinking like, I'm from Detroit, we don't go to therapists? But I respected him, and so I went to a therapist. And it kind of started a process of healing after my mom died, And so I think that one of the things that have to happen first and foremost is the conversation, And the conversation is, you don't start with a set of what's the word I'm looking for? Assumptions, none whatsoever. And that's hard, because the stereotype tells us to look at each other as suspicious, So you have to kind of get over that. Some of the pop culture language, I don't want to say what it is. But okay, so let me say this as a professor. Please take a look at I want to mention one book in addition to Tommy Curry's The Man Not. I want to mention Assata Shakur's autobiography. Because Assata Shakur and her autobiography, Assata Shakur was initially a Black Panther who became part of the Black Liberation Movement, Black Liberation Army, I believe that's what it was called. And she was accused of killing a police officer, but the facts were otherwise. And Assata Shakur ended up in Cuba. You seem like you know what I'm talking about. Question coming from you next. She ended up in Cuba. But Assata Shakur talks about the need to deprogram ourselves with some of the assumptions. And she talks about some of the language we sometimes use jokingly with one another that is harmful as Black people. I want to see if any of the young men have any questions. We can talk without the microphone, with the microphone, doesn't matter. Yes, sir.
I have a question. As a young Black man that goes to HBCU, we talk about toxic masculinity in a lot of the areas. And coming from my perspective, when taking accountability, like I'm going to therapy and actually trying to work on myself. And we have conversations with Black women. How could we make that a more comfortable space for young Black men to talk to our women without being called sassy or emotional? Even though we are being emotional and vulnerable, how can we have these uncomfortable conversations to make everything comfortable?
That's a really good question. I think people are going to need to be retrained. And I really do, because sometimes therapists, the best therapists will, and I'm not a therapist, my PhD is in Spanish, and Black Studies in Latin America, but my own experience after my mother died, the best therapists helped me to discover the truth. They weren't looking at me like, it's from Detroit, he grew up in the 80s, crack was really big, maybe he used some weed or whatever, and kind of asked me. It's like, so what you, in the conversation with you, and I've never used weed, not that it's wrong, but I never used it. So the best therapist doesn't start with the question of, when did you stop smoking weed? You know, they start with, you know, what do you think about, you know, recreational drug use? You're like, well, you know, my dad's a pastor, and I wanted to try it, then I thought, no, it's not good. And, you know, you don't know what the kid's gonna say. So I think both have to kind of come to one another like, I know you're black, I'm black, but that doesn't mean I know you, you know? And so I think you would need a man and a woman both present in those sessions who are looking to, who are not taking a side, who are looking to bring in understanding. So anybody can be asked, well, do you want to say it like that? Is that the right way to say it? Let me give you an example. When we started an effort at the University of South Alabama to address black male retention in the school, we had to jump through a lot of hoops in the process. We couldn't call it a Black Male Retention Summit. Yeah, I'm saying that on camera. We couldn't. We did all the stuff we could do. At the time, I was leading the effort. And I noticed, I was all black men working on this, the few that are there. And I noticed that some people said, well, you know, we're gonna have to have a talk with them. We gotta figure out, we gotta correct them, and da-da-da. And I was kind of like, chill out, guys, chill out. Like, we don't know what's going on with them yet. Like, maybe somebody's grandpa died and they were being raised by their grandpa. Like, you don't know what's going on with the people yet. So we have to approach it like that, you know, instead of, you know, I know you already think I'm a piece of meat. You know, you don't know what the guy thinks. You don't know what the woman thinks. So you kind of have to get to know each other all over again. And that requires humility. Yeah. But I think therapy is a really positive thing. But both sides, I think, have to see each other as, how do I need to heal? Because I've been lied to about my men, I've been lied to about my women. I've been lied to about gay people and trans people, you know what I mean? I've been lied to, you know? So I've got to relearn. And the other one I would say, the other text I would say, I hope I get one more question from a young brother. The last thing I would say is look at the movie, Denzel Washington produced a movie called Antoine Fisher. If you haven't seen it, watch that movie. Watch that movie. That movie will help you to understand the vulnerability of young black men. Sometimes in their own families, they're not always vulnerable to other men. Sometimes they're vulnerable to women. Okay, so you also have to be willing to look at that, you know what I mean? I'm working on a project about it, but I can suggest some work by James Sweet. He published an article you can find easily on Google Scholar called Mutual Misunderstandings, about an individual born in the Kingdom of Benin who had male sexual characteristics, but within their society of origin, this person was born somewhere in the early 1500s, and they had male sexual characteristics, but when they were shipped to Portugal against their will, they lied down with the women on the ship. And as soon as they got off the ship, they put on feminine attire and drove the enslaver mad. It's absolutely crazy. And so what I'm trying to understand this individual, because my jaw dropped and I kind of thought, do I want to include this? And I thought, I said, you know what? This wouldn't be an example of manhood, but it is an example of some sort of gender and sexual identity. Let me include it so the book brings in, you know, gay and straight men and trans people. So the book is inclusive. So but there's some good work being done right now. Yeah. It was a thing. It existed in many societies, these types of subject positions. You can also look at Mexico. There's a group of people called the Muxes, M-U-X-E-S. They weren't considered women. They were akin to women, similar to women. Mm-hmm.
And in India as well, there's a lot of interesting conversation on pre-colonial India and gender, and that, you know, scholars have argued that, similarly, that sort of this binary was really a product of British colonialism. And really quick plug, go see Monkey Man, everybody, directed by Doug Patel, because it touches on this. And it's an excellent film. It's out in theaters right now that has this portrayal of like non-binary individuals who are sacred to Hinduism, and I don't want to get too much away, but they fight back against some rulers, some problematic rulers.
Thank you very much.